Hi, everybody. I'm Zahara Hill. I'm a front page editor at the Huffington Post. Before we get started, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the war being waged on trans kids throughout the country by legislators, specifically by Texas Governor Greg Abbott. He's among a number of politicians who've committed themselves to perpetuating inequality and ensuring the concept of otherness remains steadfast across the nation. So at the end of this panel, we'll share some resources for you all to help fight these anti-trans bills. So I'm going to throw out a few terms, and I want you all to attach a face to these terms and take notice of the image that first appears in your mind. Islamophobia, police violence, and domestic violence. So over 30 years ago, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to illuminate the experiences of those who sit at the crossroads of more than one marginalized identity. She was inspired to do so after a series of court cases involving discrimination complaints that were ultimately dismissed because the courts, mirroring society at the time, would only recognize discrimination on the basis of either race or sex, not both. So circling back to the terms I put out there earlier, raise your hand if you thought of somebody other than a Middle Eastern person when thinking of Islamophobia. Did you think of someone other than a black man for police violence? Raise your hand. And domestic violence, a straight woman. So this was what Kimberly was trying to convey, that we sometimes struggle to understand that oppressed people exist out of a singularized framework of their oppression and can sometimes take on more than one plight. Black women are also victims of police violence. Gay men are victims of domestic violence. Black men and women can also be victims of Islamophobia. And it's media's job to enlighten us to that and constantly remind us of that, which is why we're here today. So in this session, you're going to hear from members of the Black, queer, gay, and trans communities on how to use the concept of intersectionality to give everyone a seat at the table. First, helping us do that is Aiden Korotkin. He's a director of photography and video producer based in Philly. He's shot amazing films for ESPN, MSNBC, National Geographic, and the U.S. Department of State. And he's worked on shows such as the Netflix show Rotten and A&E's America's Most Wanted. And he's also worked on the award-winning feature documentary Transmilitary, which premiered at South by Southwest in 2018. Next up, we have Dr. Jonathan P. Higgins, an educator, national speaker, freelance journalist, thought leader, and media critic who examines the intersections of race, identity, and gender in entertainment. They were named Business Equality magazine's top 40 LGBTQ people under 40, and their work's been featured on sites like Essence, Ebony, Complex, and MTV News. And they've worked on several inclusion projects with Fox, NFL, and Apple. They hold a doctorate in educational justice and often write and lecture about what liberation means for Black, queer, fat, and non-binary people, and how we can help them not just survive, but to thrive. Ben Abraham works at Storyblocks. He's a DC-based senior brand manager and marketing strategist that works at the intersection of social impact and consumer marketing. He's executed marketing initiatives for the EPA, CDC, and U.S. Department of State. Additionally, he's worked in the agency space on building awareness campaigns for brands like Tylenol, Clear Eyes, and Dramamine. And he's currently at Storyblocks, where he directs the Restock initiative focused on increasing the pipeline of diverse footage in the stock media space. So welcome our panelists, everyone. All right, so we're going to start off by asking you all to define what intersectional advocacy means to you. We'll just go down the line if you want to start, Ben.
Oh, great, thank you. Sorry, I'm having kind of a situation here. Thank you, everybody. I think for me, so thinking about what intersectional advocacy, so I'm really big on the component of advocacy, meaning that you understand what the issue or what the problem is. I am trying to move the conversation in all of my work to accomplishship. So the idea that ultimately you know that there's an issue that's present. What are you doing to help rectify it? Noting that you understand your privilege. We all have it in some kind of capacity in our lives. And so really just trying to understand, how do we utilize whatever privilege we have to help change the systems that help create or sustain inequality. I think the other thing too, I think is so important. So one of the things that we've been talking a lot about on this panel is how I actually landed here. I had a friend who was initially supposed to be on this panel, who was a white trans person, reach out to me and say, hey, you know what? I don't think that this is a conversation I need to be a part of. I think your work, I want to elevate your work and what you do. Would you be willing to do that? That for me is what intersectional looks like, recognizing when you take space and make space for other individuals to have the platform. And so for me, understanding that as an actual definition, it really becomes about this idea of recognizing who you are, where you align with privilege in your world and in the work that you do, and how you're making space for folks like myself who ultimately don't have the ability to just ultimately walk through the door, if that makes sense. So
shout out to Sarah Rogers of the Transgender Film Center. That's who they're talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
Aiden?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that, other than, in my experience as a white, straight passing, cis passing trans man with an invisible disability, like just using my privilege to, open the door for whenever I can. And to relate that to what Jon was saying is just, basically holding space whenever possible, and recognizing your role in doing so.
Ben?
Thanks, Zahara. So to me, it's really thinking through intersectionality through the context of not being a binary experience. You look at this panel in particular. We are not a fully intersectional panel. There are intersections that we as advocates for historically excluded communities have the opportunity to amplify through our voices, our perspectives, and our own listening. Myself being a gay male, a Jewish male, I can't possibly represent the lived experience of everyone, but ultimately I can be an advocate and listen and learn and bring experiences to the table that help those underserved voices be heard. Finally, from like a marketing perspective, I'll be talking a lot about the Storyblocks experience and sort of how we brought a lot of these ideas to life. It's really thinking about your target audience as more than just an audience or customers, but humans that have intersectional experiences that you have the opportunity to bring to life through your marketing, your creative, your actions, your talks every day.
Awesome. And how can we use these perspectives that you all just spoke about to best advocate for communities and create a safer existence for marginalized people? Jon, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So I think about, for me specifically, I always think about the individuals who helped me kind of get here, right? It was a Black woman who gave me my first opportunity to freelance. It was, a Black queer person who ultimately opened the door for me to work in media the way that I do. And I think for me, I always say, I think many of us struggle with understanding kind of where oppression starts and where it ends. But I ultimately definitely think that we all kind of have to step back and really kind of understand the role that we have in kind of keeping it going, right? So I think for me, I've always kind of said, intersectionality as a construct is not just understanding where oppression meets, but really thinking about how I play into it, how I ultimately have become comfortable with the things, and when I step up and when I don't in relation to that, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think in that sense too, it's important to be intentional about the experiences that you can create as well. So like for me, when I'm building a team for whether it's on set or like post-production or pre-production, I'm intentional in making sure that there's people in those spaces that are underrepresented elsewhere, especially if we're going to interview someone who has a disability or is a victim of domestic violence. Having someone on the team that can build trust with the individual that we're working with, or just in general. I mean, because you can't you can't give your best work if you're not comfortable in your workspace. And so making sure that it's intentional and that you seek out the people that will best fill those roles, and not just having them be like a checkbox, in your place of work.
And your incredibly diverse portfolio speaks for itself, but how do you approach intersectional advocacy in your production work?
Yeah, I mean, so again, just to reiterate, making sure that you're intentional about who you're seeking out. On sets in general, I try very hard to make sure that there's people who don't look like me, who don't come from the same background. And again, it's not just, okay, so you're a black queer woman, okay, you're good enough. It's not that. I mean, there's plenty of people out there who are very qualified for the positions, and so doing your research, making sure that you can find those people. I mean, especially in 2020 and 2021, there was a whole bunch of lists going around of people who were like, okay, these are diversity lists. So there was a queer list for people who were camera or grip and electric related that was going around, and there's other people who are LGBT and then people of color. Those lists, all of those resources are out there. So just trying to find those and making sure that the people that you're seeking out also you connect with as well, and then to just make sure that the workplace in general is a safe place for everybody in terms of, so if there's a problem, they feel like they can come and talk to you. I try on every single one of my sets, try to say that, if there's a problem, I want you to come talk to me. And for example, there was, I was working for a company doing some instructional videos, and one of the PAs was being harassed by the gaffer. And I found out about this a couple of days after it had been happening. She had come to me and said, just offhandedly, like, he's making these comments. And I was like, well, you should say something. And she was like, I don't feel comfortable doing that. So I said something for her with her permission. And he's not worked on those sets since. So making sure that it's a safe and comfortable space for people to express themselves, that they can then do the best work that they possibly can.
Awesome. I guess I'll let you take a breath now.
Thanks.
Why is an intersectional approach to production and media planning important? Ben, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think if you really think through a lot of the corporate or like marketing setups from the production landscape that we've seen recently, there's a few particular case studies that I think are really compelling. One recently is Sony hired I believe it's an EVP of intersectional marketing. This was really impressive to me in reading more about that position, learning about how taking an intersectional approach can effectively start early in the production planning process. So when you're concepting, when you're ideating, when you're brainstorming, when you're starting to go through that pre-production phase, that's when you should be having those conversations. Also, when you're moving into the production process, as Aiden had mentioned, really take a close look at your crew, at the folks that are ultimately outputting this product and ensuring that they're able to meet the challenge of an intersectional approach to production. From a business perspective, it's also quite important to really consider like how having an intersectional approach to production can effectively output business results for your company. This isn't just something that's a nice to have at this point. If you're not doing it, people are going to see. So they're expecting this at this point. This isn't a nice to have.
They're expecting and requesting.
Yes.
And just as a note too, I think it's important to remember that to approach everything as other people are human and you're human. And so, yes, you'll make mistakes, but if you come to the table thinking that, my way is the right way, this is the way that we have to get it, especially in documentary, for example, you're gonna miss out on so much. And making sure that you're listening to the people around you. You can bring all these people in and have a team that looks diverse, but if you're not actually listening to what they're saying, that's not gonna get you anywhere either.
Also put them in leadership roles. Having a diverse team, having an intersectional team that's at the bottom of the rungs and doesn't have a voice at that leadership table doesn't make a difference.
Right.
And you mentioned making mistakes. How can brands who might be fearful of cancel culture or getting diversity wrong kind of overcome that for the sake of creating inclusivity and initiatives and propelling intersectionality?
Yeah.
Anybody?
Okay. I was going to say, I think the biggest thing for me, and we've seen this conversation around cancel culture so much, I honestly believe, and I've been really thinking about the intentionality around how I frame the way I move around this world specifically. So thinking about it from the lens, and I talked about this earlier, us all having privilege regardless of where we come from, right? I have a doctorate degree. I have I'm able to actually pay my bills now. So like, there are all of these things that ultimately posit me a little bit more forward in, the scheme of capitalism. But I think about it from the standpoint too, with that privilege, what I do with it, and thinking about the intentionality around where I put my money or how I help other people get into the room with me, right? This idea that when we really talk about it from the lens of like being afraid to mess up, we're all gonna mess up in one way, shape, or form. I always think about the incident around me and Angelica Ross. We were doing a panel together and I said something that came across to her as transphobic. She pulled me to the side and checked me on it. And now I'm looking at it from this frame of, yes, I am going to, even as a queer, non-binary person, I'm still going to mess up, even if I think I'm doing the best thing. The reality is what am I going to do the next time I mess up, or how am I going to make sure that I'm more cautious about that before? So yes, someone may say you did something racist or you did something transphobic. The work becomes me waking up every day saying, let me do less of that, right? And I think that that's the thing many people miss. They get so upset with being called something. And I always tell people, you can call me anything you want, just put doctor in front of it. But I think the reality of the matter is, I'm still doing the work to become a better person. I'm not Jesus, I'm not Beyonce, but I will get there one day. And the reality is even Beyonce, as we learned yesterday, messed up, with the whole diamond situation. But with that being said, we all are, we're not above, reproach. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that in the work that we're doing, specifically in media, in entertainment, where everything is so visible, you have to sometimes just shrug your shoulders and say, hey, I'll do better next time, and these are the steps that I'm doing. Great example of that is Chelsea Handler. Chelsea Handler had a talk on the Ellen Show about where she kind of went back through her career and talked a lot about the things where she messed up and said terrible things. And there's this whole book that she put out about the work that she did as a white woman in media to be better to black women that she ultimately came in touch with her work. So I think it's very important for us to just sometimes sit back and say, I'm gonna mess up, but I hope to do better next time.
Yeah, and I would say too, we were talking about this the other day of like how perfection is a byproduct of white supremacy, particularly patriarchal white supremacy. And as a person, as a white person, as a trans person who has always, because of how I grew up and everything, and trying to put myself out as how other people want to see me, perfection, not being seen as perfect, has been detrimental. And if I'm not seen as perfect, then I'm, it reflects on the whole trans community. Then I'm gonna get canceled. If I say something racist and someone calls me out on it and I feel defensive, it's not necessarily about me in that moment, and remembering that and realizing that and taking a step back and saying, okay, so how can I remedy this situation, and how can I learn and move forward and not do that again, like you were saying. But yeah, really remembering that there's no way any human being can be perfect all the time, or perfect period, really. And recognizing that is taking a step against white supremacy, patriarchal white supremacy, and really understanding and moving forward with, okay, so let's figure out how to make it so that everybody's comfortable here, and we're getting what we need out of this.
I think beyond perfection, which is a great point, if you think about a lot of the foundational frameworks of patriarchal white supremacy, not only do you think of perfection, you think of urgency. I have to get it right, I have to get it perfect, I have to get it done quick, now, yesterday. And that's just not the case. You need to like take your time, do it right, learn from those mistakes, and go forward.
So put your ego to the side, and even Beyonce messes up. Main takeaways. So during social movements like Black Lives Matter or celebratory months like Pride, we see corporations in peak advocacy mode. This can look like plastering a rainbow on your website or black squares all across Instagram. Sometimes these gestures fail to go beyond symbolism. So what does authentic versus inauthentic advocacy look like in the media and marketing space?
Yeah, I've really, I've said this on so many, and actually I think that's why I've kind of gotten some of the following that I have. You know, I think the biggest thing, and when I say pay us and pay the dolls, what I'm really talking about is opportunity, and I'm not just talking about opportunity in February. I'm not just talking about opportunity in June. I'm not talking about opportunity in October. You know, a lot of black, specifically black trans, non-binary people, we struggle throughout all 12 months of the year. And so having a conversation about transphobia in your company in January is going to land in the same way it would land in June. Having conversations about why there's no black people in your C-suite is going to hit the same way in February as it does right around Malcolm X's birthday, right? I think it's so important for us to really have this conversation that activism or any type of acknowledgement of advocacy means that you are doing something continuously. And that is the issue that I have with a lot of companies, that they want our dollars in these months where they're selling different things or they're marketing different things, but they don't care about us outside of the months that are quote unquote tailored to us. The other thing that I think is really important too is who are you bringing into the conversation? And this is something that I see often where I only see the same 4 people talking about the issues in February or June or in October. And it's ultimately, in my opinion, there are so many other people out there who are doing work on the ground and on social media and writing books or writing articles for Medium that people are not reaching out to them and giving them opportunities. And so I think, you know, I will say for me personally, as a black non-binary person who has utilized social media to make a career out of it, I'm blessed to have the circle that I have around me who's looking out for me and saying, hey, Jon, we want to make sure that you can survive and live and you know, and thrive. But I also think about the conversations of companies and organizations that are saying, oh, okay, well, it's February 28th. We don't have the work to do anymore. Come, you know, March 1st. And you're looking around and you're seeing them constantly mess up or constantly flub. And I'm thinking to myself, if you just have this person on retainer and you were giving them $1,000, $1,500 every single month, you wouldn't have the problems that you have. And so I think about that, right? What is the game plan? What are you doing ultimately to make sure and ensure that not only I can live and thrive and put cheese on my hamburger, but at the same time, really thinking about too, like, what are you doing to make sure that the work doesn't look like you're only showing up when it's convenient?
And cheese in your hamburger is very important.
Very important. You can't eat a hamburger without cheese now.
No.
You do it.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, like, stop asking people to do stuff for free. Stop asking black people to do stuff for free, especially when you're going to profit off of that exponentially. You know, it's just insulting. It's just insulting. So,
beyond asking them to do things for free, also asking when you need to fill a gap in your content calendar to benefit your corporate organization. I think ultimately, from the Storyblocks perspective, the way that we've really looked at increasing the overall access and diversity representation of our stock video library is really thinking, where do we fit within this conversation? And I would challenge any marketers in the room to think about, you know, what can you do more than a corporate donation to make an impact? What's the challenge that's happening right now in your specific industry that you can, you know, be the leader, be the expert on, and engage folks that, you know, are interested in an improved product that addresses their needs. That's where user research comes in. That's where talking to your customers comes in. But ultimately, there is opportunity. You've seen it with brands like Unilever. You know, they went through this specific initiative, I believe it was a couple years back, to remove the descriptors normal and gender from their beauty products. So effectively, you know, by removing those gender and normalcy attributes, it debunks the idea of what is beauty, what does race or gender really play into beauty products. So taking that perspective is really important when you're examining how your industry, can step up and be part of this opportunity to change.
Right. And so I just want to add one point too, because I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the disability community, which is just, just lost. They're just lost, and they're also people that consume things, and so adding stuff like captions to your videos that are on. I mean, who listens to sound anymore? Really, when you're scrolling through Instagram, it's just you're listening, you're watching the video with the captions. It's something, small stuff like that that's just so simple to add that doesn't really cost anything either. That also then brings in whole swaths of other groups to your content and media and in general.
Can I add one more thing too? I was going to say, we're going to be doing that a lot. Can I add one more thing? Because we're all kind of in that mind. But I think as I'm listening and as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about this idea of people will ask me all the time, Jon, how did you get there? And I think of the companies and organizations too that created programs to help give people the tools. If you look in terms of statistics, you'll find that a lot of Black and brown, disabled, non-binary, queer people don't have access to the information that we all have that we maybe got out of a doctorate or a master's or even a bachelor program. And so when I'm thinking about organizations that actually take some of their money and say, we're going to start a program to not only train these individuals, but ultimately in turn hire them so that they can continue to move up, that's something else to me that I feel is very important. I see a lot of organizations that are saying, how can we make things better, but we don't have the people, we don't have the resources to do it. And I'm going, actually you do. You can just start a program, train these people for 3 or 4 months, and then ultimately hire them, and now you have the people. I'm one of them. So really thinking of it at the end of the day, there are resources, it's just, do you have the heart or the mind or the will to actually put the wheels in motion behind that? And shout out to iHeartMedia for doing that, because they're one of the organizations, both Twitter and iHeart ultimately helped me get here today, and I'm really thankful that they ultimately put their resources behind to make sure that folks like myself have a platform.
Yeah, and sorry, one more thing. To just think about too, if I can remember that train, because it's leaving the station right now.
We can come back.
Yeah, come back, because it was there, and now it's gone.
For more self-interested organizations and corporations who must see some kind of payoff for giving everyone a seat at the table in their intersectionality initiatives, what does that look like? How does intersectionality help support a brand's perception and drive business results?
I remember what I was going to say, but then we can answer the question. But also stop thinking about people as singular dimensional beings. All of us up here are intersectional, to use Kimberly Crenshaw's term, and we come from different backgrounds. We have different experiences. Not one single person in here. Maybe if it was the very first human beings on Earth are in those boxes, but we have Venn diagrams in our lives, and so to just market to Black people during February, queer people during June, it's kind of just erasing every other part of and facet of their lives, and so to be inclusive and intersectional really makes it so that you see those people as multidimensional beings.
Kimberly
and
would be
then,
proud.
Sorry, and then what was your question again?
Kimberly would be proud of you right now.
I'm trying.
But how does intersectionality help support a brand's perception and drive business results?
Yeah, just to quickly answer that, and then I'll pass the microphone, but I think that it's so easy to tell when the brand does not mean it. And so if you're just doing it just to get the likes or the capital from the people that you're trying to appeal, and not actually backing that up with, for example, there's companies out there that are all about pride during June, but then we'll go and donate to anti-LGBT candidates or campaigns and partner with Chick-fil-A, for example, for whatever. It's so easy to see through just that veneer, basically.
And I think that, clout chasing also plays into this a lot, where it's like if you're chasing the diversity card or chasing this opportunity to build clout with your customers, they can see right through it. This is ultimately a differentiation strategy for your brand and for your company. When you're thinking through your customers, thinking through how you interact with them through different touch points of your marketing efforts, think of them as more than just conversion targets or sales targets. They're people, they have a voice, and they have the opportunity at this top of your funnel where you're reaching out to them to really be stewards of your brand in a long-term capacity. So, we've had some specific case studies through Storyblocks Restock Initiative where we approached diverse stock media pipeline, effectively in working through this initiative and working with cinematographers and directors such as Aiden to create these collections that aren't like boring white men in business suits, or like white women eating salad. What stock media is. It's one of those things that we have the opportunity to tell a story that depicts the world as it actually exists. So when we conducted outbound sales efforts and we shared information about this restock initiative, we experienced results. And when we didn't mention it, less people replied to us. So we have data that basically speaks to the fact that this is a differentiation strategy, this is a tool, our customers are asking for it, we've been delivering, and there's more work to do. The work's never done.
And there's something to be said about brand loyalty too. When you have people that you show that you can appease them in whatever way you're trying to, people build a loyalty to companies that see them.
And what are some tangible steps that our audience can take to incorporate intersectionality in their own work and business outputs?
This is you, Jon.
Well, all right, here we go. I'm just kidding. I would say the first one, pay us, pay people well. I think that there needs to be some sort of interrogation around the idea of this notion of, when you talk about clout chasing, this notion of exposure, paying the bills. Sally Mae knocks on my door every day at the same time asking for her payment. And so I think, thinking about that, right, I did the work on my end, make sure that you pay me if you're asking me for help. I think the other thing, too, that I think is so important is really thinking about who you are bringing to the table. I always use this kind of, I'm always a context to content person, or a content to context person. Really, for me, it's this idea of oftentimes I'm invited into the room and people are like, hey, come to the table, but you can't have the steak. Okay, everybody else over here can, but you're getting a burger. And then when I'm going to eat, they're like, oh, actually, you don't get a napkin. And it's like, okay, well then why did you ask me to come? And so I think about that, right? What does equity truly look like in the organization and in the company? Why are you asking me to come to the table? What's the reason? What's the conversation? And if you're going to ask me to come to the table, do I have the same voice that everyone else at the table has? Because ultimately, that's another thing. Oftentimes I say things and it comes off as combative, or it comes across as me having, anger or being upset. And I'm like, yeah, I should be angry and upset because I'm oppressed. Every day something's coming after me. And we talked about this yesterday, and I think it's intentional and important for me to mention it. I think as we're talking about this idea of what can we do, it's recognizing that these systems are not happening in singular fashion. I say, or my mom used to always tell me, if they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night. And I think about what's happening right now. People are going, oh, that doesn't impact me. That doesn't affect me. I can just go to work, do my stuff. I just go home. And I'm going, but they're going to still come to your home and get you too, because they came for me. And if you Google me, you will find that folks came for me in 2017. And that is ultimately how I landed here. And so I think it's really important for folks to not feel like that any of the stuff that's happening in our world does not impact you, because it does. What happens to me as a Black, trans, non-binary person is happening to Aiden. The same thing that's happening to Aiden is also happening to them, and it's happening to anyone else in this room. And so I think it's imperative that when we're really talking about that, right, the urgency, that's what I'm really trying to get you all to kind of grasp. There's this urgency that I constantly have in my work, because I'm going, people are dying. People can't eat. People are homeless or houseless. People don't have access to health care. You have, as much as you may feel like you don't have the power to do something about it, you can. By simply saying, what are our HR, what's going on in HR? Why isn't this equitable? I don't understand why we don't have anyone who looks like me here, or why when you tell me to bring my whole self to work, it's deemed down on my review.
And I think examining all those current seats at the table and recognizing those gaps, thinking through plans, from a tangible output perspective for your business on how you can fill some of those gaps is quite important. An example that I'd love to share is when we worked on our most recent launch of our Restock initiative, we focused on collections that were centered around Indigenous and First Native humans and basically sharing their lived experiences through the power of media. We did not have anyone on our immediate marketing team that represented these communities, and we had to learn because our customers were asking for it, and we needed to come up with a plan to address that. So we actually called on the Smithsonian American Museum, the Museum of the American Indian, to come in and speak to us about particular stereotypes, particular watch-outs and opportunities for us to address from the get-go as we went into the concept development process. And we really knew that that wasn't necessarily enough to have an hour workshop and expect us to land it completely. So we did hire an external consultant, creative director, Josue Rivas, who is the founder of Indigenous TikTok. So he is all about just like media and ensuring that the creative direction of our initiative really landed in a way that was not only respectful but representative of his community. And we paid him quite well.
I love that you brought somebody else in. I'm a huge fan of people who can say, I don't know crap about this. Let me pass the mic.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Aiden?
Just to your point of like, if they come for me today, they'll come for you tomorrow. There is that poem that was written.
Love that quote.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was saying I love that quote.
The poem, after the Holocaust, that was more or less says, they came for this group and nobody stood up for them. They came for this group and nobody stood up for them. And when they came for me, no one was there to speak up for me. And I feel like that just is that is just such an important thing to remember. Like, if you don't stand up for your neighbor, if you don't stand up for your colleagues, who is? And then who's going to help you when you have to fight for something? And then just to reiterate the fact that it does nothing to bring all of these people on, to hire people in the communities that you're trying to address, and then not listen to them and not hear them. So really making sure you're open to hearing what they have to say, and then taking that and going forward with what they've contributed.
That's a perfect transition, talking about standing up for your neighbors. So a lot of advocacy tends to be rooted in self-interest. And while that kind of activism is imperative because sometimes you and your community are all you got, it can also create a tunnel vision. So I want to ask you guys, how do we close the gap between marginalized communities in the sense that we're all fighting for one another and not just ourselves every day?
Zahara, when we talked through this yesterday, I think there were some very interesting pieces that we had to think about, and I kind of went back to my Airbnb and I was thinking about it, and I was going am I truly showing up for everybody the way that I should, right? And I think about it from this idea, someone that I know very closely, they always say, when I eat, we all eat. And there's this notion of or literally, when I win, everyone else wins. That whole concept of a rising tide lifts all boats. I genuinely believe when you get out of this idea of making the work about you and about the legacy that you're leaving behind, that's when things start to shift and change. I often love to say that I am literally finishing the stories that my ancestors didn't get to tell, and they left me a blueprint on how to do that, right? And so it's now my job to do the same for the folks who want to be on this stage at Southwest in 2024 or 2050 if we still here, child. But the reality of the thing for me is just really trying to get to this place of saying this work is not about me. This work, and when I say the work, what I'm talking about is Kimberly's idea of intersectionality, right? Understanding how we can eradicate oppression and white supremacy and privilege and all these different things. It may not happen in this lifetime, child, I hope it does, but it may not. But I think for me is the little bit of work I'm doing, right, by giving other people a voice. I'm helping to amplify the voices that come behind me. I'm helping other people to understand what it means to be a better advocate. And I'm not placing blame on anyone. Really what I think this work is about, when I say this work, what I'm talking about is I think what we all kind of do in our day-to-day and trying to give other people opportunity is really getting other people to be able to live authentically and work authentically from a place where they're not working from fear. I think we have to have real conversations about culture and the culture of fear that's created in a business culture, and really having this conversation about what does it mean to bring your whole self to work, especially when you go to work day to day being fearful that you're gonna get fired for saying that somebody said something racist or homophobic to you, right? And so I think about that, like that's the work. The work is how do I get people to see that and not be fearful of those conversations, but to do work around that. So that way we can all come to work and we can make sure that we can pay our bills on time in a very happy way. So.
Yeah, and I think even speaking, even outside of like just general social advocacy and into the workspace too, I'm thinking about like in the film industry, especially with freelancers, there's a sense of like, if you do well, I'm not going to do well, and then you're taking away from my success. And that's just not true. I mean, it's kind of the same principle that Issa Rae talks about of networking laterally, and when you're coming up, so are your peers. Like, if you're doing well, then you can also give opportunities to you know, Ben or Jon or Zahara and help them come up, and you're elevating the art form and elevating your community and elevating your peers and your colleagues. And everything is just going to be of a higher level. And so the notion that it's a zero-sum game and like, you know, you can't do well, you can't do well because I have to do well. That's just not true, and it's a false narrative. And you know, taking it to the social realm of, you know, if trans people get rights, then I'm going to lose my rights. That's just, it's not true. It's just not true. I mean, if you're coming from it a perspective of, you know, you've had all the rights, then, you know, I guess you can say you might lose the opportunity to oppress other people, but that's not equal platform. So,
I also think that a desire to help, a general curiosity and empathy beyond yourself goes a very long way. Most recently, I did have a friend that was going through the process of gender-affirming surgery. I personally have not been through that experience, but I did really recognize and took it as a call to action as a white gay male to ensure that I'm really connecting with you know, my trans sisters that are ultimately going through things. And while I did not have all the answers and she was not ultimately connected to a lot of those resources at hand, I did make it my mission to help and find out and be the connector. So I do think that we have to think beyond ourselves in our everyday to break down some of those barriers within our own communities.
yeah, and to that point, I don't think there's an excuse to not know anymore. There's so much information out there. There's so many you know, groups that you can go and find more information about. That if you, let's say you're not part of the disability community, but someone's asking you to help them, or you know, you have a coworker that is trying to look for resources. There's so many different opportunities to, one, educate yourself, because you are the steerer of your own ignorance, I guess I would say, or education. But there's just not a good reason to not know anymore, in my opinion.
Well, folks, those are all the questions I have for our amazing panelists. We're going to open the floor up to you all now.
Bit unconventional for the sound guy to come in, but these are actually issues I've been aware of and have really enjoyed your talk today. I'm hearing a lot of stuff about, you know, like improving and diversifying certain corporate organizations. However, I feel like sometimes when you've got a culture or a society where many of the operations in business today are solely predicated on perpetuating these systems of structural racism or economic exploitation or ecological destruction, could it be gilding the lily a bit to diversify an organization whose entire business model is causing pain to those same cultural segments across the broader field of stakeholders?
That's a really good question. I'm gonna look at you two.
Yeah, so we've had this conversation. So I will say, I am the first person to say that I am a label, I hope this is okay, I'm a label whore. Everything I have on right now is Ivy
It's
Park.
okay now.
I am through and through, I love a good label, especially if it's created by a Black person, right? I genuinely believe, though, that there's no way for us, and I'm just gonna say this, loving, there's no way for us to get away from capitalism, period. There's no way for us to get away from it. The system has been set up for it to continue to keep thriving. We all benefit from it from some way. However, there are caveats, and I think that that's the thing we have to be mindful of, right? And so I shared a moment yesterday where I have a bag. Her name is LV, and she's sitting at my Airbnb. She's heavy. And so ultimately, people will look and think I walked into an LV store and got the bag, and I said, no, actually I didn't. I know a Black trans woman who is who does basically consignment, and she just opened her store. And I found out about her store, and so I bought the bag from her because I wanted to make sure that the money that I was gonna spend on that bag went directly to a Black trans woman's hand. And so there are ways for us to be intentional about the ways that we kind of play the game of capitalism. And I think that that's the thing that many people miss, where they go, don't eat at Domino's because of this, or don't use Apple because of that. And it's like, okay, yes, girl. But there are other things there are other ways for us to kind of break that down. And so what I think is really important in this conversation, right, is to think about the ways that you engage problematic behavior for people or keep problematic things going. Case in point, I hate that I'm calling people out, but hey, you gotta call them in too. Elon Musk, right? Tesla's cute. I would love a Tesla. But I also think about this idea about how problematic that man is and some of the things that he is doing with his company. And so when you really start really engaging with it and thinking, okay, well, what are the other things that I can do to kind of break that system down? That's ultimately how you're still kind of feeding into this idea of change. I hope that helped.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I apologize, I was late to the panel, but if you didn't talk about this already, what about the burnout and emotional cost of doing this work? Because a lot of us don't talk about that. And, I know Jon Paul, and, on Twitter, on other places, people think that you are a resource and not a person. So how do you all deal with that, whether you're doing this for a company, for yourself, or just the fact that people see your name and or a Twitter check mark and think that you are Google Light and they don't have to go do the work themselves? So how do you deal with that work of, if I get one more DM asking me to be your token Black friend today, I'm gonna lose it?
I'm just gonna say, what I learned transitioning and becoming a more or less a appearing cishet white man. What cishet white men do that nobody else seems to do is make sure they take the time to step away and take the time for themselves and with whatever it is. And learning that is harder. I'm still trying to learn that, but making sure that you take the time to really just, if you need the space and to shut off, to actually do that. And realizing that is okay. It is okay to do. Because I think that's one of the things is that we just, there is so much going on, and it is exhausting, and you can't be on all the time. You can't be on all the time. I mean, when you take the breaks, you're able to refresh your, battery. You're able to refresh your approaches and maybe your perspective on things too, and then, come back harder than before.
I also think it's important to not try to be everyone's hero. So effectively, we were talking about this a bit yesterday, where if a client approaches someone like Aiden and asks for some crazy motion graphics thing, Aiden might be like, I know a person. I'm gonna actually save my time to focus on effectively what I'm best at, and I'm gonna farm this out. I'm gonna outsource. I do really agree, though, that this concept of, protecting your peace and really showing up in a way that when you're there, you're fully present, and you've protected yourself in a way that if you're not able to show up, 100%, then don't show up at all.
Yeah, I mean, because that's also activism too, right? Being able to take the time away from the onslaught of patriarchy and capitalism and white supremacy, because it's always going to be there. It is always going to be there. But like thinking about it as coming in waves. You're in this cohort, and once you get here, then you can fall back and take a break, and then you come back again. I think taking the time to really focus on yourself a bit is also a form of radical advocacy.
I was going to say, what's the only word that's universal in every single language? No. And I think that is ultimately what I have politely learned to say, especially since I am a blue check mark. I get a lot of people who jump into my hey, Dr. Higgins, I have this question. Okay, well, Google is also there. And I think about it from that perspective of, I've learned that Google is not the end-all, be-all answer. And sometimes Google is wrong. But I do believe, for me, I've learned how to navigate conversations. And I always like to tell this story. I'm very much a story person because I'm a storyteller by nature. But I remember once I was reading a book in the airport, and a woman came up to me, and it was, what book? I'm trying to think of Dr. Joy DeGroy's book. And it was ultimately, I forget the title of it, but it was basically Slave Syndrome. That's the book. And so as I was reading it, this woman came up to me. She was like, oh, can you tell me about the book? And I said, well, you can take a picture of it and Google it when you get home. Have a nice day. And I walked away from her. And some people say, oh, Dr. Higgins, that's rude. And I'm like, no, it's not. Because she wanted me to lecture her on what that book was about. Versus when I go to events and people say, oh, you know what? My son or daughter is non-binary, and I'm trying to navigate this conversation with them. What would be some good resources for me to be able? And I go, oh, okay, well, follow them.us. I wrote an article about it in 2018. I have another friend who, my friend Shar. All of these people, I can give you resources, but I think there's a vast conversation between people wanting to mine you as a data hound because they can get to you so easily versus someone saying, I'm doing the work and I just need a little bit of guidance on how to actually get to where I'm trying to go. So sometimes I just simply say, nah, not today, sis.
You're not a Cliff Notes.
No, I'm not. Or pay me and I will be.
Any other questions? Hey.
Hi, thank you for this. This was excellent. So I want to push a little bit on that idea of fear and having that within organizations. So as someone who occasionally goes into organizations and talks to them about equity and justice and how it can work in their processes, how do you kind of make the distinction between who you will work with and who you don't? I'm thinking of a company that approached me and was saying all the right things of we want to be better and all this other stuff, and then at some point they just kept throwing in the word comfortable or the idea that they needed to be comfortable. And I let it happen 3 times and I was like, let me stop you right there. That is not how I cover this, and some discomfort kind of needs to be involved in that. I did not work with them. Well, they chose not to work with me. That's fine too. But I guess I'm wondering what distinguishers do you make as you're trying to decide who is ready to do this work versus who kind of just feels like they need to do it? How do you make those decisions for yourself in the work that you choose to do?
John, you want to start that one?
Yeah. I always ask for a timeline. And I always like to say, can you give, and specifically with my manager, we always like to work with timeline and resources. How much money are you willing to put behind this? How much time? And ultimately asking people, what are the things you want to hope to attain? And if those things don't align with who I am, specifically as a quote unquote brand, then I'm not going to just come in for a one-off and you pay me and then you can say, check mark, we did it. No, I want to know that you are vested in this. And there are companies and organizations that have reached out to me and said, we're going to do this for a year. We want to take 2 or 3 months off, and then we'll come back to you in 2023, and we're going to have a conversation. Okay, cool, let's do that, right? But I think it's really important to really just get a scope of how long someone is committed to that work. And recognizing, too, I think specifically in the work that I do, because I have worked with a lot of different brands on DEI conversations, I think many of them, too, when you start talking about comfort level, right, there are some people who come to you and say, I don't care about the comfort level. I just want to get this work done. I want to make sure that we are doing the right thing as an organization. And then there are companies that are like, oh, I'm worried about our funders. I'm worried about the people on the board. Okay, then I'm not the person you want to bring in. Okay, you may want to call somebody else, but I'm not that girl. And so I really think ultimately just being comfortable with this idea of that even for you to say that's not for me, that's okay. If you want to do performative over there, that's not the business or the ministry that I'm in. But ultimately, timeline is so important for me.
I also worked previously for the government, and we had these services agreements where we could only work with certain businesses. Now that I'm working in the private sector, we have the opportunity to, build those connections, create our preferred vendors lists. So ultimately, I do think that a lot of times there are resources that exist that are out there of folks that have been ultimately vetted to do this particular work. So I do rely very heavily on references. There's actually a gentleman that's here speaking. His name is Nate Nichols, and he runs a Slack group and a conference called Allyship in Action. And I found that group in particular, all working in the marketing and media space, people will go there and be like, hey, I need somebody that can help me with this thing. And I think references always really help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say too that while this is for your job and your income, what are you getting out of it? Are you just getting frustration? Are you getting headaches? Is it, you're going home every night and saying, what the hell am I doing? That's kind of a telltale sign for me. If it's something where it's like, maybe this will move the needle on something, then I'd say, is that worth it for you?
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you guys so much. This is really great. You talked a bit about it earlier, which is like brands contributing to a cultural dialogue. You mentioned like Black Lives Matter. Another one like it's particularly unsuccessful was like when Pepsi did theirs with Kylie Jenner. So I'm curious, and I'd love to know, like, from you guys, if there are specific examples of brands or companies that you think have done a really good job at, like, contributing to the cultural dialogue in a way that's, like, both insightful and knowledgeable and kind of, like, contributes in a positive way.
I think we're all required to say Storyblocks.
Yeah, Storyblocks is this.
And we talked about this before too, but Fenty, Fenty Beauty, Savage Fenty, Rihanna is so inclusive. She has people who are disabled modeling her lingerie, fat people, all kinds of people. But even she has messed up before. During one of the Savage Fenty shows, she played a song that had sacred Islamic verses, which upset the Muslim community. And she received a fair amount of backlash for that. So that just goes to show, like, even everybody, including Beyonce and Jesus, is going to mess up. But I think Fenty does such a great job of that. And you said corporations, but also the All Black Lives Matter movement. I think that is such a great intersectional movement as well. But yeah, do you guys know of any other corporations or?
I would encourage you to take a look at the inaugural Anthem Awards. They're a spinoff from the Webbies, and effectively it was brands that were encouraged to apply and highlight their effective initiatives that really approached from a DEI lens. And I could list a number of case studies from Anthem Awards. One in particular that really resonated on my end was City's most recent initiative with their, basically their goal was to ultimately ensure that trans folks do not have to go through difficulty in navigating, removing dead names from credit cards, banking statements. And I thought that was a particular initiative that really took an audience pain point, a human need, and addressed it in a way that was relevant to their financial institution.
Mm-hmm.
What's the name again?
Citi, CITI.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you.
I was going to also say White Lives for Black Lives. Matt McGorry talks a lot about that. Specifically in SoCal, they have a chapter, and they're doing a lot of good work, especially around policing and using themselves and using a lot of the resources that they have in order to stop kind of like the policing or the different things that happen in the I would say Los Angeles specifically, in the justice system that could be considered inequitable. So.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
We have any other questions? All right, folks. So I'm just going to close out with the Kimberly Crenshaw quote. She once said, "If you see inequality as a them problem or unfortunate other problem, that is a problem." So today we're challenging you all to widen your understanding of inequality so that it recognizes the many who sit at the crossroads of several forms of oppression. And the trans advocacy resources I mentioned earlier, if you want to all Google and share the LGBTQIA+ Student Rights Toolkit, or donate to Equality Texas, ACLU Texas, Fiesta Youth, or All Go. Or you can call Governor Abbott on your way out at 512-463-2000. Thank you.